And we'll also have a period at the end for anyone to ask any questions if you have any. Okay, so we'll just jump straight in with a bit of a very basic info on aging. So what we understand and what we know is from the science that is around aging is that aging happens in stages. So if we take the example of someone with, for example, heart failure, we know that typically from a functional point of view, that in the late stages of disease, we start to see a loss of the functional resilience. So you might actually begin to see disability, frailty, reduction in exercise tolerance. Before you get to that late stage, there's a stage when it's more phenotypic. And at this stage, you're going to see changes in the blood work. So for example, some of the biomarkers you might see to change are things like BNP, which is a typical biomarker used for heart failure. But actually, even before that phenotypic change, there is a stage before that, which we call the biological resilience. And this is the stage where you start to see molecular change and molecular damage or inflammation. And this is actually the stage that GlycanAge focuses on and works on. So when we think about GlycanAge, the main thing we're focusing on is the problem that currently exists in the system, and actually how does GlycanAge work as a solution for this. So, you know, I said at the beginning, one of the reasons why I was frustrated with working in healthcare was because there was this lack of focus on prevention. But how do you actually go about making prevention possible? How do you go about changing from a disease-focused system to one that actually focuses on the individual and improving prevention? Well, ultimately, GlycanAge aims to be a solution for that. It's an evidence-based objective tool which aims to predict disease and can do so up to a decade in advance. And I'll talk you through some of the research we have on that. But also it can be used to validate. And the reason I say this is because many of the doctors and partners we work with have various protocols. But to understand if a protocol is working for a patient, you often need a personalized test. And that is what GlycanAge offers, a personalized objective test. Further to that, I think when we think about prevention, a lot of that requires behavioral change. And behavioral change is very psychological, and actually a huge part of it is motivation. And so having an objective tool that you can see, that you can measure to understand if something is working or not, and you can actually use to motivate the patient, again, is something that I as a clinician recognize to be very important. So just to touch on some of the science, some of you may be familiar with this already, some of you may not, but I'm going to talk a bit about glycans, what they are and why they're so important, and give you maybe some examples that I think will help just, you know, really show the gravity of how important they are. So glycans essentially are these complex sugars that exist on the surface of pretty much every cell in the body. When we think about typical proteins, most of those proteins are actually glycoproteins, which means they have these, sorry, one moment. They have these sugars on the surface. And so these sugars are typically used for cell-to-cell communication. And one of the reasons they're so important is because they actually give the protein functionality. Without these glycans, these proteins wouldn't function. And one analogy that I like to use is the concept of a bird with no feathers. So if we think just about the protein, the naked bird is just the structure. It can function to some extent, but it's not at its full potential. It's only when you add feathers that the bird can actually fly. And glycans are the same with proteins. So proteins are almost like a structure, a framework, but it's actually the glycans that make them function. And just as an example, you can see here the COVID virus, and the blue furry things that you see on its surface are actually the glycans. So you can see they're very branched, highly specified changes in the features to the protein, which help it to function. So just to give you, again, a bit of science and a bit more focus on how important they are, PSA, which stands for prostatic specific antigen, is a commonly used biomarker used to determine if someone is high risk of prostate cancer. And actually, when we just look at the protein, you can see in this graph here on the left, the sensitivity specificity, is only 60%, which is actually quite poor. But when you actually look at the glycosylated protein, that increases significantly to 94%. So, you know, we're really driving and trying to explain that highly specified nature of glycans that adds a high level of specificity and sensitivity, and just how important they are in the human body. So just to kind of, again, pull that home, I mean, the GlycanAge test in particular, works with glycans, hence the name Glycan Age. And we look specifically at the glycans attached to the IgG. And the reason we look at this is because it's a key glycoprotein in the adaptive immune system and the most abundant antibody in the human body. So when we think about that, and we think actually about what the adaptive immune system is, it's actually something that tells the whole story of our disease and immune response, because it literally is that. It's an immune system that adapts over time. So glycans ultimately are these functional factors which attach to the IgG antibody. And when we look at GlycanAge, what we're looking at is actually the glycans that are on the surface of IgG. And this tells us a really holistic story. The reason for this is because actually we think about the DNA, and the DNA is transcribed and translated, and that determines what glycans go on to these IgGs. So by looking at glycans, we're looking at the holistic picture and the whole story, both of genetics, epigenetics, and the functional protein. Now, a moment ago, I think a question would have popped up on your screen, which asked the question about how much DNA do you think humans share with flies? Don't know what answers we've got so far. Just have a look. Give you a minute to answer that if you haven't already. Okay. Okay, well, if you've answered already and you answered 60%, then you would be right. So the reason I make this point is because if we think about fruit flies and humans and how different they are, they're significantly different, but actually they share 60% of DNA. Now, the Human Genome Project was an amazing amazing venture. However, clearly it doesn't tell the full story. These two organisms are incredibly different, yet they share so much DNA. So there is so much more to the story. And we believe a lot of that comes down to the glycans, as I've explained, in terms of how important they are. So this brings us down to this point. Ultimately, individuals have a glycome which is unique to them. And as I said, we can look at the structure of these various glycans on the surface of IgG to understand if someone is moving faster towards inflammation. So they have a lot of pro-inflammatory glycans versus anti-inflammatory glycans. And you can just see on this small graph in the bottom that actually the different glycan structures can help us to determine that. And this is what we look at when we measure glycan age. So actually, I think one thing that's important is all this information and this understanding the science behind it is relevant because it helps understand why glycan age is such a useful biomarker. And I think for me as a clinician, one of the most important things is the fact that it's a responsive biomarker. So we have a significant body of research which shows that glycans are responsive to interventions and also both lifestyle and pharmaceutical. So looking, for example, at various supplementation, looking at things like the effect of hormone replacement therapy, as well as low caloric restriction and high intensity exercise. This is all information we have. And what we see is that actually when we implement these changes, we can actually see those glycans change. And again, we go back to that very important fact that actually when you have responsive biomarkers, they can be used to motivate patients, but even more importantly, they can give us information about what is working and what isn't working. So just a couple of examples here. We've worked with Professor Tim Spector for quite a long time. He's a well-known professor who was director of the twin studies and is also founder of the Zoe diet, which is a personalized diet. And he's been doing his Glycan Age, so his biological age testing, way before we even became commercial. And actually, you can see on this graph here, so the orange line is his biological age, and the green line is his chronological age, or what I like to call the driving license age. And as you can see, he was always lower than his chronological age, so was doing relatively well. However, started to see that aging increasing in rate, and so made the decision to start taking metformin. Now, it's important that we do mention that Tim does have insulin insensitivity, and so there was a reason for taking metformin there. But as you can see, when he started taking it April 2020, we see this significant drop in the biological age. And this is what we mean when we say responsive. And I think it's really useful if you imagine what that must be like for an individual to actually see that change, both for their personal health or as a practitioner, being able to see that something is working to that effect. But similarly, it's not just about pharmacological interventions, it's also about lifestyle as well. So a similar story, except in this case, this is someone who has quite a busy lifestyle. Biological age is higher than the chronological age here, so not doing quite as well. But made a significant change to lifestyle in terms of sleeping more regularly, increasing exercise, and also changing the diet. And again, you see a significant drop in that biological age in response to that lifestyle. And so that element of responsiveness is incredibly useful and valuable. The other, I think, most valuable feature of GlycanAge is that it's a predictive biomarker. So we know that glycans are predictive and they can preempt disease up to 10 years in advance. So if we're looking at these graphs on the left-hand side, you can see there are 8 boxes, and in each box it represents a glycan, so one of these complex sugars that you see on the surface of IgG. The red marker in each of the boxes represents when someone has developed diabetes, so they have diagnosed diabetes officially. The marker before that is 4 to 2 years before they've developed diabetes. Before that is 7 to 5 years, and before that is 8 to 10 years. As you can see with all these glycans, there is a trend and a movement towards that development of diabetes. And this is what we mean about predictiveness. So actually, before disease develops, we can see that actually someone is moving towards or away from that. And again, that ability to understand if someone is moving away or towards disease is incredibly useful, because at this early stage, it's still reversible, and therefore you're able to implement preventative changes. So this is not just the case with diabetes. Diabetes is just one example. Actually, we've seen this with a number of different glycans, and we've seen it with cardiovascular disease as well. In fact, one of our papers, we were able to see that the 10-year risk of cardiovascular events was more predictive than the American Heart Association score. And so again, this is just highlighting that incredibly useful ability of glycans to show changes within the body and measure inflammation, which obviously has a huge impact on the aging process. Furthermore, of course, one thing about GlycanAge is we have a really big focus on our research. That's a huge part of what we do. And actually, what we know is that when we've done studies looking at other clocks, so Horvath clock, we looked at DEXA scanning, various other clocks, what we find is that actually GlycanAge is, or looking at glycan specifically, is the best at predicting future hospitalization. So in these outcomes that really matter to patients, again, you're seeing that increased predictiveness. So just going to talk you through the test for those of you who are not familiar with GlycanAge already, to give you some information. And I see we have a question which I will just leave till a bit later, and then I will answer that question. So in terms of the test itself, the test is a very simple blood spot card. So essentially finger prick test, and you apply 4 spots of blood. It goes to our lab, which is based in Croatia, and we actually test the samples in triplicates. The reason for this being that actually we understand the value of accuracy, especially when you're using it to understand if interventions are working. And so we send it to the lab. It takes 2 weeks to process, and then you receive a report. And that report is broken into 2 separate parts. The first part is the general result, which gives you information about your age versus biological age. But actually, I think it's really important, again, that we recognize it's not about although the initial age is useful, actually that's just a small part of the story. What is most useful is understanding that that age is changeable, and actually it's the second test after interventions that is very useful in understanding if something has worked or not. And so that's the first part of the test. And then in terms of the second part, we break that into various indexes. So if you remember at the beginning, I was showing the different structures of various glycans and showing that some structures are specifically associated with inflammation. So what we do is we break this down into various different groups or classifications, and we have the anti-inflammatory indexes, the inflammatory indexes, which suggest if this is particularly high, that person has a high level of inflammation, and then also the supportive indexes. And this is helpful to help tailor interventions to the patients, but also to give valuable information about what might be driving that high or low age than expected. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to one of our amazing partners, Dr. Lucy Prince, who is the founder of MyMedics, but also the medical director, and has been doing some really amazing work with GlycanAge in her practice. And so she's just going to take us through some case studies. So Lucy, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Very, very sketchy connection. I'm currently in rural France on holiday with my family, and we have a storm, and we also presentation without my signal failing. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
It's a bit sketchy, yeah. But I think we've got you.
Okay, I'm just trying to move to the next slide. I'm not sure if you can give me a hand. Apologies, Simi. Are you able to move me to my next slide? Thank you. So I'm the medical director. I'm also the co-founder of MyMedics. I'm a very proud NHS doctor. And it is absolutely not without its limitations, as we've touched on. And I also share the same frustration: reactive system as opposed to a proactive system. Deployment of the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine and the National Board of Lifestyle Medicine, and I think having the dual accreditation of being NHS trained and experienced, but also having that additional training and experience in lifestyle medicine has really helped us create something quite special at MyMedics. So within MyMedics, we are an entirely doctor-led service providing evidence-based clinical care, hoping to prevent the occurrence of disease in healthy patients who have that. We are regulated by the CQC. What I thought I would do, if it's helpful, is just to run through 3 examples of patients that I've treated recently in my clinic. I've had their permission to share this information with you today in an anonymized way. And I've tried to choose sort of very different approaches to lifestyle medicine. This is our first patient who is 50 in age, was 54. This is a lady who was quite overweight, who was struggling to access high quality, timely menopause care in the NHS, and was a little bit disappointed with her initial score of 54. So we looked specifically at her glycan youth marker. That seemed like a good place to start, and we were delighted. Might be able to do it for me. Simi, are you able just to move that slide along for me?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Thank you. These were the measures that we implemented. We helped her with some weight loss using a GLP-1 agonist. She was commenced on a bioidentical HRT regime, and she also had supplementation with high dose vitamin D, an NAD plus supplement, and a high quality probiotic as well. And she was delighted with her subsequent GlycanAge score, which was done only 8 weeks later than her initial test. So really, really thrilled that the result had come through so quickly, and that the changes that we were making were clearly having a positive effect. Excuse me. And, you know, we touched on motivation at the beginning of this presentation, and I think this is a really wonderful example of that, and a really, really good example of being able to show patients with the use of GlycanAge tests, actually, that the things that they're doing are really working. And we're continuing to work with this patient. She remains very motivated and is doing really well. trying a really, really interesting patient to work with. This is a 35-year-old, very fit and well, actually, no established disease, really into high intensity impact training, shift worker, working as a NHS intensive care nurse. Very stressful job. And lots of night shifts during her rota, young, optimizing her nutrition and exercising. So she was, I mean, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that she was devastated. She was really, really upset with this mark, this score. So 20 years older than her chronological age. So we addressed a number of factors, but predominantly focusing on the glycan youth indices. And these were some of the measures that we implemented. Completely changed her exercise regime. So we switched from an evening high intensity impact training program and focused much more on a restorative exercise program, yoga, long distance walking, and we changed the timing of that crucially to being many hours before she would be sleeping. She did also change her nocturnal work patterns in that time to enable her to have more nocturnal sleep, which I think also helped. And she did some other additional lifestyle modifications. We reduced alcohol. She wasn't drinking much alcohol, but the little that she was consuming, she stopped. High dose vitamin D supplementation. And she also reduced but didn't stop her red meat consumption. So again, we tested at an 8-week interval, and she was delighted with her results. So just in 8 weeks, her glycan age was reduced to 42. So this is just some lovely feedback that she left for us, which I'll let you have a read on. And I think, again, it's a lovely example of how the GlycanAge can be used as a validating tool and also as a motivating tool in this patient. And the third patient that I wanted to share with you was a 65-year-old gentleman who throughout his life had, again, really sort of prioritized his health and his fitness, as you can see from his comments here. Running, cycling, long distance walking, dog walking, very active, football player, fit and well, non-smoker, no established disease. So he said that he was delighted but wasn't surprised to have an initial glycan age score significantly younger than his chronological age. So he was 28 years on his baseline glycan age. Pretty tricky to know how to improve that score, but we took on the challenge and we focused on his glycan median score because of all of the markers. This was the one that we felt we would be more likely to help him improve. His motivation for engaging with my medics actually was that he'd had a sudden cardiac death in a first-degree family member just a few weeks earlier, which was very unexpected, and he was particularly concerned about his cardiovascular health. So within my medics, we did extensive cardiovascular investigations, including blood work, lipid profile. He had an angiogram, a cardiac MRI. And actually, he was shown to have some early coronary artery disease that had already established. So he was commenced on a high-dose statin regime. He stopped all red meat consumption entirely and switched to a fully plant-based diet, and stopped drinking all alcohol. Again, it wasn't a heavy drinker to start with. Not a huge amount of red meat consumption, but certainly quite high quantities of dairy. We know from the meta-analysis and the data available to us that a plant-based diet has up to a 25% reduction in cardiovascular mortality and morbidity. And so this was a useful place, I think, for him to start. We retested at the 8-week mark again, and his glycan age had lowered again. So again, really, really validating for us as clinicians and very motivating for him. He'd reduced it by a further 5 years, and he left some really sort of rewarding comments, I think, here that I'll just let you have a read on. I like the honesty, the 3 lapses in alcohol. I particularly liked that. But clearly, really delighted that he was able to make a measurable and objective improvement to his health. And I think this is a particularly nice example that the value that patients get from using a tool like GlycanAge is not just knowing what the numerical value is on a document, on a report. It's about understanding really what that means for them, and most importantly, I think, how to change it. And I think that's why, you know, GlycanAge are very forward thinking. They're engaging with clinicians right from the very beginning to make sure that the information they're providing to patients is done so in a way that it can be changed. Patients can be supported to improve their health, even when their baseline GlycanAges are really good already. So I hope that's been an interesting introduction to some of the work that we've done at MyMedics. And again, thank you so much for inviting me to talk.
Thank you so much, Lucy. It's always so inspiring when we see clinicians and partners who are using the test in a way to help their patients. So it's really great to hear from you. Thank you so much. So hopefully to everyone who's on the call, this just gives you some insight into just how effective GlycanAge can be, but also how you can use it to improve the aging process occurring in your patients or your clients, but also personally as well. Next, I wanted to sort of do a bit of an interactive case. I feel like sometimes, especially if you're in practice or if you're an individual, it can be hard to understand how actually you would implement a test. And so I'm just going to run through this interactive sort of case. One moment. Oh. There we go. Okay. So just going to run through this interactive case, and it would be great if everyone could engage a little bit if you can be bothered. So if you look at the chat, you can just write in the chat what your thoughts are in terms of what you might want to do in this kind of patient. So this is quite a typical situation where, you know, you have a lady, 47-year-old female. She's attending Long Life Longevity. That is a fictitious made up name, by the way. So don't take it too seriously. But she presents with sort of 6-month history of difficulty sleeping and some headaches. She feels generally well in herself, so she's not unwell, but she does feel a bit more tired than usual. She has a past medical history of just some eczema, some eczema that she manages with creams, but nothing serious of note. And she's not on any other medication, but she is taking some over-the-counter NAD+ and alpha ketoglutarate supplements. No significant family history. However, she is an ex-smoker, slim build, normal BMI, and she follows a pescatarian diet. So it'd be great to hear maybe in the chat what further questions people might want to ask, or what investigations people would think they might want to do or expect if you're a patient. I'll give a couple minutes. Check the gut, like that. Gynae history, menopause, lovely. Great, okay. So yeah, so I think those things are very relevant. And, you know, of course, as a sensible practitioner, this person decided to do those tests. So standard profile, full blood count, urea electrolytes, hormone profile as well, thyroid, sex hormones, everything, and they all came back normal, which is typical. And I think one thing that I want to really sort of make clear here is actually when we're talking about a preventative test, typically your standard normal test that you do will not show up with results. And the reason for that is because, as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about intervention from a very early stage. And so sometimes you're not going to see the changes in the bloods that you expect. So, of course, this practitioner made a decision to do GlycanAge. This patient was already having their GlycanAge done. Feel free to put in the chat what you think the GlycanAge might show. I'm going to skip ahead and show you anyway. So this patient has been doing their GlycanAge for some time, as I mentioned, and typically they've been doing very, very well. So this patient's driving license age or chronological age was 48 up until 52, and they were testing at 28, 29, so doing very well. However, on the most recent test they did, the GlycanAge had gone up to 58. So a significant increase, almost a double. And obviously that dramatic change, you know, as Dr. Prince was saying, that actually when you see those kind of dramatic changes, it can be really quite hard hitting. And you know, one of the things that we always encourage our clinicians to do is make sure they prime their patients, prepare them for the result, because it's not, sometimes it's, you know, a lot better than they thought it'd be, and sometimes it's a lot worse. And it's, as I said, it's so much more about the change and seeing the improvements of the Glycan age as opposed to just the initial age. But in this patient in particular, of course, the impression was perimenopause, given the age and also some of the symptoms being quite general that she was experiencing. And so the action plan made there was to work with a practitioner to manage the symptoms, but 3 months later made a decision to start bioidentical, HRT, continued tracking the Glycan age in response to therapy. And as you can see, in April 2020, you know, you do see that initial drop again in response to treatment. And so we also have a report called GlycanAge, which is specific to cardiac markers, and actually looks specifically at your cardiac risk. And actually it's only available in women at the moment, but ultimately you can use that to understand if HRT is working as expected. And we have quite a few clinicians who are doing that. So I guess one really important question is, can the biological age be improved? I mean, I think we've seen a number of times from a number of cases that it definitely can be improved. But how to do this, I think, is the hard part, and is something that many of the partners that we work with, I mean, we have over 500 partners across the globe. It's the one thing that everyone is trying to work out. And ultimately, what we're seeing from the work we're doing with partners is that it's all about systems biology. It's all about systems-based approach. We know that various systems in the body are interconnected and there's an interrelationship. And actually, by targeting any one of these, you are helping to address the aging in terms of aging in terms of inflammation. Supplement wise, I think this is a common question that we get from a lot of clinicians, you know, what supplements do I give? What supplements work? It's a difficult question to answer because I don't think there is, again, there is no one size fits all. I think there's information about what supplements can work, but again, it is about picking supplements or treatments that address that system's biology. So addressing meta-inflammation, looking at the blood glucose regulation, again, gut support, which I know someone has mentioned in the chat, and also detoxification, antioxidants. So, you know, the list goes on, and there's a wealth of information out there. But actually, as GlycanAge, one of the things we're trying to do is give clinicians, partners, individuals a tool that helps them to understand if something is working in them, and also if their protocols are actually working for their patients. As you heard from Dr. Prince, that actually when you do implement these programs, they do work, and having that validation can be, again, very useful. So, I mean, I think one question, and I can see there's lots of questions in the chat, so I will answer them eventually. One question is, why GlycanAge? I mean, with the wealth of research we've done, one thing we know is that glycans are directly involved in the pathophysiology of pretty much every major disease. And I think they're going to be incredibly important in terms of us understanding how we actually address aging and disease. And also, of course, because we are lucky enough to have an incredible glycobiology science team, rigorous quality and accurate standards, and also over 200 studies, you know, we're well backed by the science that supports us. In terms of comparison, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are so many biological age tests. I'm sure it's almost overwhelming at this point. But I think it's useful to highlight some of the differences between different biological age tests. So one thing I think is important is that a lot of tests like methylation, telomere length shortening, while they are great in terms of especially measuring the chronological age, one thing that we're not focusing on chronological age. I mean, the chronological age is the benchmark, but actually the aim here is not to have a test that just tells you how old you are. The age here is to tell you how internally old you are in terms of inflammation. And so our test specifically focuses on measuring inflammation, which many of the tests do not. But also, because it works in that way, it's able to respond to interventions, which I think we've spoken quite a lot about. Another just important point I want to make, and I think this is probably interesting mainly for anyone out there who's a scientist or a very budding researcher, is the fact that at GlycanAge, as I said, we hold our science at the center of what we do, and our work from the scientific point of view never stops. This figure on the right is taken from one of our most recently published papers, which we're incredibly proud of. But it's ultimately looking at various diseases and actually the glycan fingerprints, I would call them, that they have. So to put that into context, what that actually means is that various diseases seem to emit or demonstrate these very unique glycan signal patterns, hence the term fingerprint. And actually, in the future, this is something that could be used for diagnosis. But as I'm sure many of you are aware, the path to diagnostic testing is very, very long. And like with any research, if you have something that could be valuable and beneficial to patients, you don't hold it and you don't hide it and hold it. You give it out. And so at the moment, what we're doing is we are presenting this as a wellness test, a test that can be used in practice with partners who understand how it can be used. But actually going forward, the aim would be to try and get this to diagnostic test level. And so actually for our early adopters, what we're doing is we're giving them the insights that we have from the research we're doing, which of course is, I think, as someone who believes in evidence-based medicine, I think is the best way to work. Finally, I think I've made this point a few times and I'll make it again. We understand that the longevity and wellness space can be quite confusing. One of the challenges that we definitely are seeing our partners have is difficulty knowing what works and what is the right thing to do. I think when we think about all the various therapies out there, from your rapamycins to your stem cell therapies to your cryotherapies, it's really hard to understand what is working and what is the best way to go. And it can be difficult to understand which is the best way to go. And so what we're trying to do now is work with our partners. We believe, we've done research with the big players, the Harvards, the universities of Cambridge, but now it's about getting on the ground and working with the people who are actually implementing these protocols. And so we are, as I said, we work with over 500 partners across the globe, and we want to help understand what interventions, what protocols work best. And I think we think the best way to do this is to work with our partners to support them to conduct this research and to assess the efficacy and the quality of what they're doing. And they can do this using GlycanAge as an endpoint. And that way they can, as I said, assess the interventions that they're applying. So what I'm going to do now is I can see there's lots of questions in the Q&A. So I think it will be a good time to sort of answer these questions. So as I said, we also have Dr. Lucy Saronic, who's also on the call, who is one of our specialists in the team. So she will also be supporting the answer to these questions. So just bear with me a moment. So yeah, if you do have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A.
Yeah, so we're happy to take any further questions. I've managed to answer some of them, so please let us know if there's anything else.
While we do that, I'm just going to go to the next slide. So, I mean, the aim of this webinar was to give information to people who are interested, who maybe were curious about what is GlycanAge. I mean, I think one thing that's important to recognize is glycobiology is almost like a hidden gem in science. Before there aren't many labs that can do this. Our lab is one of the few that can do high throughput analysis, so doing analysis of many samples at the same time. And before us, the only other lab that used to do it was a lab, I believe, in Ireland, and unfortunately that research scientist actually passed away, and that field kind of dried up and died until it was sort of revived. And so the point I'm making is that because it's such a hidden gem, we are on a mission to educate as much as possible people about just how valuable glycans can be, and not just for the purpose of where it is now, but actually for the future. We're a very future-focused company. We focus on our research. And so in terms of what we would like next, if you haven't already and you're interested, please do sign up as a partner. I think one of my colleagues will be putting a link to the website where you can sign up as a partner. Signing up as a partner is completely free. It's a place where you can get access to more educational materials. You can hear from more of our partners in terms of how they've been using GlycanAge. And if you're interested, again, you can book a call with us. And of course, because we are doing education, we're trying to share this as much as possible. So please do feel free to share about us on your platforms as well. Okie dokie. We've got a couple minutes left. If anyone has any questions that they want to actually speak, there's a feature where you can raise your hand. And if you do want to discuss a question or a point that you have, then feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you and we can have that conversation.
Manali ready, would like to talk and should be able to now.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear, Manali. Lovely to meet you.
Lovely meeting you too. I'm Dr. Manali. I'm an A&E registrar and a lifestyle medicine physician. So one of my questions was, has anyone done any study, or if you have any results from how interventions on individual lifestyle pillars and the influence it has on GlycanAge? For example, if someone who's done just daylight exposure, the effect of that on GlycanAge, or just the effect of, let's say, a sleep aligned with the circadian rhythm, the effect of that. So like, I want to know the influence of individual lifestyle pillar interventions on GlycanAge.
So one thing we can probably speak on, so recently there was a study released on sleep in particular, and looking actually how sleep affected GlycanAge. And although this wasn't specifically intervention, it did show the reverse, which would suggest that interventions to improve sleep would be beneficial. So what we found is that patients who, for example, suffer with sleep apnea typically have a GlycanAge which is 7 years older than their counterparts. So therefore, you know, in a sense, showing that people who implement changes or improvements in sleep can be beneficial. In terms of what you're asking for, more specific results, I mean, typically the thing that we see the most changes with or the thing that we've done the most research on tends to be lifestyle. So understanding the difference between various diet types or various exercise regimes. But also, I mean, we have done some work as well. Again, this is anecdotal, but we did do some work looking at NAD supplements as well. I don't know if anyone else in the team has any studies they can think of off the top of their head. But Manali, if you are interested, you can, we can try and get in touch with you and we can actually send you some of that information, but it is available on our partner dashboard as well. But if anyone else in the team has any studies they can think of that they can suggest, I think that would be great.
Oh, thank you so much. And the other thing, hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. And also, do you recommend any particular diet that has showed the best results with GlycanAge?
So I can take that one, Simi. So yes, Manali, we have actually done a study where we compared several different diets, and I'm going to actually try to find the link to that so I can copy that in the chat for you to have a look. And we have actually not seen a difference in, obtaining a good GlycanAge result, as in, finding out that there is not a single diet that would that always leads to a good GlycanAge result, which is, I guess, not something that is completely surprising, given the differences in the gut microbiome, genetics, exposure to different food antigens. So with GlycanAge, when we work with our clients, we basically do motivate them. If there is a need for them to think about how to reduce GlycanAge, we do want to help them by sometimes suggesting trying out different diets for sure, but based on glycans alone, there is not a possibility for us to say that a diet would work. We do see, however, that with certain food groups, so for example, in people who have a lot of overly processed foods day to day, and in those with a low fiber intake, we do see that their GlycanAge and some of the other, more specific indices tend to be higher.
And just
thank you so much.
Not a problem at all.
You're very welcome. And I think it's probably worth saying. So I don't know, I did mention Tim Spector before, who is the co-founder of the Zoe diet. For those, I think I said it earlier, but for those who didn't hear me, so the Zoe diet ultimately is this personalized diet. So we actually are working with them on research for that, for this specific reason, the question that you asked. So again, that just highlights that as a team, we are doing research constantly and finding out more information. And, the aim is to almost build a community, of doctors who are interested in this, who want to know more. Because we are aiming to do more webinars like this, more information. And at the end, actually, you'll see a survey that asks you if there are any other webinars that you would like to hear about. So please do answer that survey, because we do listen to it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We've got a few hands. Okay.
Okay, next in line is Mercy, and Mercy should be able to.
My name is Mercy.
Hi, Mercy.
So I just want to ask briefly concerning a diabetes patient, what alternative do you have in place of metformin?
Sorry, so just to make sure I understood the question properly, I think, Lucy, you might have an answer for this one, but you were asking what apart from metformin, what alternatives do we have for diabetic patients? Is that right?
Yes, as regards to it reducing a 10 years reduction in effect, having a 10 years reduction effect. So is there any alternative yet, or are we still working on it?
So to my knowledge, just because no one else has jumped in, what I would say is we in terms of the data or the evidence that we have, I'm not aware of any other medications that we have done that level of study with. I mean, the only other thing, of course, that people do use, especially those who want to avoid medication, is caloric restriction, which we do know has a huge impact on GlycanAge, and we have a number of studies on that. So where people choose to take a more conservative approach, caloric restriction and changes to diet have been seen to have significant effects in terms of GlycanAge. I can't speak specifically to the diabetes, but we do see that. I'm not aware of any other medications that we've had a look at. I don't know if anyone else in the team is aware.
Okay. There's no problem. Thank you.
You're welcome.
No, so sorry, I was just typing up a different answer. No, we haven't really looked at that yet. We have done actually a study to look into the effects of metformin. So hopefully that will be something that will be shared with you soon. But no, apart from metformin, nothing so far.
Okay.
Thank you.
I will be interested in that project.
Okay.
So I'll be signing up.
Yeah, so we always make sure to kind of share all of our new studies via social media channels. That's mainly LinkedIn, obviously Instagram as well. But yeah, so do kind of follow us there, and you'll be kept in touch.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next in line is Joseph Grosso. I'm not sure. Apologies if I don't pronounce your surname correctly.
Grosso. Yeah,
Grasso.
no, I understand the concept of glycosylation, where proteins are kind of being sugar-coated in regards to an HGB1AC. But this test seems like it's testing other proteins that are becoming, per se, sugar-coated. And does that specifically give us information on what tools or what things we can change for that client in regards, it was a very fast to see that one page of what you were actually measuring besides, well, I guess an HGB1AC wasn't even in there, but those other things that you're looking at as a glycosylated immunoglobulin. So does it give us some insight on how to treat that client based on, not only our indicators that we would use in our office, but from this test? I don't know if it's a clear question or not.
Lucy, do you want to take that one? I think you're on mute. Okay, I can take it.
And I just muted myself. Yeah, sorry, I just didn't hear the question. I was typing up something else. If you could.
That's fine. I
Yeah.
can give you a brief answer, and then we can give you more information. So I think it's really important to recognize that glycation and glycosylation are two very different processes. HbA1c, which you're mentioning, which we typically see or is used for diabetic patients, is a process of glycation which is random, non-regulated, and is not what we want. It's not meant to happen. We don't want to see that. This is typically people who are obviously eating high levels of sugar, and that sugar damages cells within the body. What we're talking about with GlycanAge is glycosylation, and it's not unusual that people get these really confused, but glycosylation is a very different regulated process, and it's ultimately post-translational modifications that happen to proteins when they're transcribed by DNA. So I'm going to sorry, you're going to see lots of slides, but I'm going to flip back to the slide that I think you're talking about, that you said we skipped past a bit too quickly. Was it this one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So with GlycanAge, what we ultimately, so this is only a few of them. I think in total we look at more than this. So there's 9 in total, I believe. But ultimately what we understand is that if you think about the IgG protein, the adaptive immune system, that IgG, we are looking at the sugars that are attached to that. That happens during translation of genetic material. And what happens is the type of glycan that is attached to your IgG changes based on a multitude of things, to be honest with you, but we try and simplify it down and break that down into inflammatory versus pro-inflammatory versus anti-inflammatory. So what we see is that actually when someone is going through a lot of inflammatory processes, so a lot of disease processes are happening, we're going to see a lot of these glycans that you see on the right hand side, missing galactose, they're less branched, and these are the ones that are associated with aging. On the other side of the scale, and again, this is a huge simplification, on the other side of the scale, you see these glycans that have these extra elements, and I won't go into the actual features in them, but they have extra elements on them, and these are protective. And so if you have a lot of these, you're actually anti-inflammatory. And so what we're looking at is the ratio of those two, the inflammatory versus the anti-inflammatory. And of course, as you can see, that it's not as simple as one or the other. There are quite a few in between, a lot of different ones in between, but that's what we're measuring. To answer the second part of your question, which was about interventions and how can it guide you, I think this is a difficult thing to answer, because there's not like one direct answer. It really does depend on your patient's results, but ultimately the reason we break it down into these indexes is because the aim is to give you more information about what direction you should go in. Now, as I mentioned, if I go back a little bit further, as I mentioned, one of the things that we are really strongly focusing is on this disease association. So we know that these G1, G2, G0, they're actually represented in those in the titles that we give you. So, GlycanAge Shield and those different features. So when we look at these specific fingerprints, we have an understanding of, this person has an increased risk of this disease. This is something we're working on and something that we're building into our pipeline. But the aim is to eventually get to a point where we can say, we're not at the moment, we're not trying to be diagnostic, but we are trying to give insights into this person potentially has an increased risk of this, because actually they're showing this fingerprint, which we know from our research tends to be associated with this disease. I don't know if that answers your question. And I don't know if anyone else in the team wants to add to that, but I hope that kind of gives you some clarity on the difference between those two features.
It does a lot. I really appreciate that. Thank you. That chart that you're showing though right now, how far in the future do you think you would come up with a fingerprint like that for an individual test?
I'm wondering if Nina is in the call.
I'm happy to jump in.
Thank you, Nina.
So we have limitations with the dry blood stains. We can only look at 9 of these stable peaks, which have a certain amount of glycans in them, which gives us certain insight into some of these conditions, not the full circle. We see the full circle if we look at plasma, and that's pretty difficult to do logistically. So the ones we can give from dry blood stains, that's in the pipeline now, that should be ready in the next couple of months. We're currently gathering feedback on some prototypes to see if they actually work or fit the market. And then after that, we'll work towards a plasma test, which then the collection is a little bit more complicated, but we can give the full view into the circle.
Thank you very much. Really interesting stuff.
Thank you.
Anyone
Okay,
else
and I
has
think we've got one extra person with raised hand, and that's Waida Hanush. I'm not sure if I pronounced it correctly.
Hi, this is Huwaida Hanoush. I'm a functional cardiologist, and my niche actually is women's heart health. So I missed the first part of the lecture. Does your test kit cover biologic age, whole body, and then certain organ systems like cardiovascular system and other systems, or you can pick and select what you want? Like in my case, maybe I want to select only the cardiovascular part. This is my first question. My second question, what is your age, minimum age that you test? I mean, cardiovascular disease can start at any point. My niche is targeting 35 plus women, but it can still be even younger. So yeah, so these are my 2 questions.
Thank you so much for those, Hoida. Lucy, let me know if you want to jump in, but I can initially try and answer that question. So as I understood it, your first question was about, is the test specific to different body systems and disease systems? Ultimately, the answer is no. So we specifically look at inflammation. So we're looking at chronic inflammation. Yes, you're right that a lot of tests will typically focus on one specific area of disease, but actually what we're trying to do is give a more holistic picture of what's going on in the body. As I'm sure you're aware, as I said earlier, it's all about a systems approach, and typically what you'll find is if one system is in dysregulation, this will often typically affect other systems. We see it with the HPA axis and the brain gut axis as well. And so what we're looking at is ultimately a more holistic picture that can then guide you towards where you might want to make changes. I don't know if you were on the call when Dr. Lucy Prince, who's one of our partners who's been doing some great work with GlycanAge, was talking through some of her examples. And if you do want to receive some of our case studies to see how other partners have used GlycanAge, feel free to drop us a message and we can sort that out. But ultimately, to sort of simply answer the question, it's about holistic views to then give direction in terms of which way patients should go. Having said that, we do, because your specialty is in cardiac health, we do have something called GlycanAge. So GlycanAge is something that's only available for women. The reason for this is complicated, but ultimately it's a bit easier for us to get the information we need from the dry blood spots that we use. But ultimately, the GlycanAge in particular can look at the cardio health of women. So again, I don't know if you were here when I mentioned that actually we did a study, and actually our 10-year cardiovascular disease risk was better than the American Heart Association score. So we're really talking about deep level science here and the ability to really understand what's going on in the body. And one of the reasons we don't go down into specific disease specific level yet is, as I said, there's a number of bits of research that need to be done on that, but also it's also about giving that big picture view. Then I think you asked the question about minimum age. So so our cohorts of patients that we have information on range from 20 to 80. So we typically would say people between 20 and 80 are who we would test. That's not to say that someone older or younger can't test, but it means that the GlycanAge result they're going to get is going to be between 20 and 80, because that's the cohort that we work with. But you could be 90, I guess, and have really great result and be having a GlycanAge of 70. So I hope that answers your question. If not, please do feel free to elaborate. Don't know if Wade is still there.
Oh, hi. I didn't know that I was unmuted still. Yeah, it answers my question very well. And I like that actually you're saying 20 even. I mean, that's my belief. Cardiovascular disease can start even very earlier. Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
I can add a point on the gender differences. Basically, we see a gender difference between which glycans are predictive of cardio events. In women, it's one certain type of glycan that we have on the dry blood stains, hence we can provide it. For men, it's a group of a number of different structures that not all are stable on the dry blood stains, so we don't provide the same report for men yet until we switch to plasma.
Thanks, Nina. I think we probably have time for one more because we're just running over a little bit. I think there's only one more hand up. Happy to answer that question if it's still up.
Joseph, if you still want to speak, feel free to, but it might be just that the hand is still raised. Yeah.
Okay. Okie dokie. I think we probably end there. Everyone, thank you so much for joining today. I really hope it was useful. I hope we answered all your questions. If we didn't, I think my colleague has put where you can sign up as a partner in the chat. Alternatively, feel free to drop us an email I think we'll put it in the chat, but it's partners@glycanage.com, and you can ask us any questions that you might have directly to us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll stop the session now and hope everyone has a lovely afternoon or evening. Thank you.
Thank you.